Welcome to part 4, where I'm going to address some of the questions I left off with in part 3, such as, who were some of these key individuals that were mentioned in the official reports? Who is Carlos Marcello? Who is Clay Shaw? Did any of them have ties to the mafia? Did they have ties to each other? Did Ruby, Jack have ties to Carlos Marcello? Did Oswald? Well, I'm going to have a few answers today for some of those questions. So let's start off, let's talk a little bit about Oswald. So Lee Harvey Oswald was an American man who allegedly defected to Russia and then returned to America. And the official reports would paint him as someone that had mental health issues. They kind of give a brief history of his life. And so when he was 13, he was diagnosed as emotionally disturbed. And I looked into this, and what does that kind of a diagnosis mean in the year 1952? And so what I came up with is that it was often used to describe children that were like a disturbance in class or maybe had a learning disability. So I kind of thought of it like ADHD. I'm not saying that I'm a professional and know what psychology diagnosis meant in 1950s, but just based on a quick little search that I did, that's what it looked like. So Oswald, he joined the Marine Corps when he was about 18, and then he served for 4 years and then got out. And shortly after that, he traveled to Russia, where he ended up meeting a woman named Melinda, and they got married and had a child and came back to America, where they lived in back and forth between the Dallas area of Texas and New Orleans. Something that I found somewhere online mentioned his uncle, who was apparently a shoemaker in New Orleans and may have had ties to Carlos Marcello, who we will dive into in a moment here. Lee Harvey Oswald, as we mentioned earlier, is the only man that was directly linked and supposedly shot JFK. And the only evidence that all the authorities, all these agencies could find pointed to Lee Harvey Oswald, who maintained throughout that he was just a patsy. And I find it very interesting that Lee Harvey Oswald got his job at the book depository around October 13th, and the motorcade in which the president was shot was November 22nd. So more than a month went by since the time he got that job. And the route wasn't even released to the Secret Service, or they weren't made aware of it, until November 8th. And I did hear that it was actually changed at the last minute, so it maybe even changed from that, initial decision or whatever when they released it on November 8th to the Secret Service. So we'll kind of go into whether or not he may have had ties with certain groups or individuals that would have people under their employ that actually worked for the government or other agencies and may have had knowledge of the motorcade route. Maybe that's a possibility, but it's quite a coincidence that over a month before the assassination, this man gets a job at this depository, which just happens to have a perfect line of sight of the president at the time of the shooting. So the Warren Commission would paint this report that, he may have tried to shoot a man named Edwin A. Walker back in April, and he may have also tried to assassinate another guy, and there may have been political reasons for that, and that he was involved with a political group and was kind of like an activist in that group. And they also claim that he bought this Carcano Mannlicher that was found at the scene, that's a rifle, that they can confirm through the study of handwriting samples that he's, in fact, the one who signed for it and bought it. Granted, as I've kind of mentioned earlier, the Warren Commission wasn't exactly the most trustworthy source. As I mentioned before, Gerald Ford, who would later become president, he was kind of like a whistleblower twice. And the first time would be him saying, this commission didn't do due justice this investigation. They ignored stuff that didn't match their preconceived notions or what they wanted the official report to read, what they wanted the public to believe. There are also photos of Oswald with the rifle in question and the revolver that will come in later on his hip. And there are questions as to the legitimacy of those photos. The official reports of these official groups, so the Warren Commission, the HSCA, House Select Committee on Assassinations, and I think even the Church Committee, if I remember correctly, they all were confirmed, yes, that was his rifle and these photos are authentic. However, there are professionals out there, and you can watch some in-depth videos analyzing these photos, suggesting that they're edited. And I found a very convincing video with an elder gentleman who analyzes photos, and he broke down some of the photographs that kind of look like mugshots of Oswald throughout the years. And he actually cut some of them in half and shows that they were two different men. And one of them looked like Oswald, and the other looked like an officer for the Dallas Police Department back in around that time of the assassination. And it's alleged that the person in the photos holding these guns might actually be that man and not Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm not saying that that is the case, because I'm not a professional that breaks down photographs and can tell you what's what. But based on what some of these professionals had to say, and just based on some of the photos that I viewed myself, I would tend to agree that maybe some of the official conclusions were arguable. And it does seem rather convenient that Lee Harvey Oswald be a patsy. But I can't tell you that he wasn't involved, because he was there and he did have access to a location from which those shots could be fired. However, and we'll get into it later, there's no possible way that he was a lone gunman if he was a gunman involved at all. So, according to the official reports, the recreation of Lee Harvey Oswald's day, or, a small time window around the time of the assassination, would say that within 2 minutes of the shots being fired, police officers and co-workers of his would place him, and that he was not out of breath or anything. He was totally calm. Whereas, this sniper's nest that they found was up on the 6th floor, and they found palm and fingerprints. So one finger and palm on multiple boxes, and a palm print on the rifle, which that can be fairly easily faked, by the way. And I'm not saying that they did. I'm just saying it is possible. And also, why is it just his palm and his finger on all these boxes and stuff? Like, what was he just palming everything? I mean, maybe, I don't know. If you think about how you grab a box and how you carry it. So, according to the report, Oswald then left the book depository, boarded a bus, but he got stuck in traffic, hopped off, took a cab, went to his house, changed, or his apartment, wherever he lived, and then left again, where an Officer Tippett, which I mentioned in part 1, well, we're coming back to that with a few more details here. So Officer Tippett allegedly stops him, and he shoots him multiple times. And they were, I think, 4 times, because I believe it was 4 casings that were found at the scene of the crime, which would allegedly match Oswald's revolver. Which is interesting, considering a revolver doesn't dump the cartridges. You have to manually eject the cylinder and dump the cartridges. So unless you wanted to leave evidence or reload immediately, in which case you could still have dumped the cartridges into your pocket or something and not leave them at the scene of the crime. But allegedly, those were confirmed to have been from that revolver. And shortly after that, he ran to the local theater where he was arrested. And allegedly, according to the local police, he attempted to get some shots off unsuccessfully, which, how do you... I have doubts about that statement. Let's just leave it at that. And he was arrested with that gun on him. Now, it would be very easy to plant that, and I know that sounds like a very strange thing to say. But I'm going to get to another person in a little bit here that will help explain why I might make that kind of assertion. On a personal note, I also didn't see anything about a gunshot residue test having been done on Lee Harvey Oswald, which is something that has existed since 1933. I don't know, however, I had a difficult time trying to find when it became commonplace and when it started being used in the court of law to assert that someone was likely to have been the person to have shot another person. So maybe it wasn't commonplace yet, but they're asserting that this man shot the president. I would think that they would do a gunshot residue test. I'm not saying that they didn't, but as far as I could find, I don't think they did. Also, supposedly, that revolver had been modified to shoot a different type of ammunition than when it was manufactured to. Therefore, it wasn't possible for the panel to determine that those casings that were found actually were indeed fired from that gun. Also of note is that the official report states that one of the most difficult things for the Warren Commission to find was a possible motive for Lee Harvey Oswald to have shot John F. Kennedy. They claim that it could have been a combination of things, including political ideology. Apparently Oswald was a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, under which Cuba was ruled at the time under Fidel Castro. And then the mentions earlier of people that he may have attempted to kill, they refer to that saying like, oh yeah, he had the potential to kill because he tried it before, with absolute zero evidence that he actually did. And there was never a charge. These are unsolved alleged crimes that had been committed. They don't know who did it. They postulate that maybe it was Oswald, and they try to indicate that it was. Another person I mentioned that I had questions about was this Clay Shaw character. And, did he have ties to Oswald or Ruby or some of these other people? So just a quick rundown on Clay Shaw. He was the only man who was tried and accused of being involved in conspiracy to kill the president. And apparently that didn't stick because he was actually acquitted. But it was Jim Garrison who really tried to pursue that and pursue him. And supposed ties that may have existed between he and Oswald were some assertions by people that were interviewed. So there was an employee by the name of Corey Collins. He worked for the Congress of Racial Equality and was in Clinton, Louisiana in the summer of '63 and allegedly saw Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald pull up in a black car and park near the Register of Voters. Another person placed Lee Harvey Oswald in the line. Apparently, we were still segregating a bit because he called it the colored people line. So people of color were in a separate line, but there were a couple of white men in that line, and he said that he believed them to be Clay Shaw and David Ferry. So there actually are transcripts available from the trial of Clay Shaw. Unfortunately, you have to buy it if you want to access the entire thing, which I have not yet done because I'm stubborn and I'm upset that you have to pay for it. Because the whole point in the Assassination Records Review Board was to make everything available to the public. But how available is it really if you have to buy it? And it's not like it's that expensive. I think it was like $4, but I was still mad about it. I may end up looking into that if everyone ends up wanting to hear what's actually in it, but I don't think it's going to end up being that relevant. So let's continue on from here. Let's move on to our next person of interest and, possible ties, and that's going to be Carlos Marcello, who you may have heard of. So even just doing a quick search on Carlos Marcello, you may find some information that he was a crime boss in New Orleans, and he had ties to groups such as Matronga's Black Hand and the Five Families of New York, and a man named Santo Traficante Jr., who allegedly he was actually close personal friends with, and the Chicago Outfit and the Commission. So he was known as in New Orleans as being associated with the New Orleans criminal underground and an ally of mobsters across the United States. And he had a lot of politicians in his pocket. So he was from a Sicilian family that emigrated here when he was about 1 or like 8 months old. And when he was growing up, he participated in petty crime and then kind of worked his way up. So one of the oldest known mafia families in the United States was established around 1870. And that would be founded by Charles and Antonio Matronga. Then in 1922, Sam Silver Dollar Corolla took over when they kind of retired, I guess. But then he was deported after World War II, so 25 years later. Then his lieutenant, Carlos Marcello, took over in the year 1947. And he expanded operations into other areas, including Dallas, Texas. Also, Florida, in cooperation with other mobsters, including the Chicago Outfit and the Five Families of New York, and allegedly worked with Trafficante Jr., his close and personal friend, who was the, I guess, mob boss of Tampa, Florida. In 1959, Marcello was actually called to testify before the Senate's McClellan Committee on Organized Crime, including JFK as senator and Robert Kennedy as legal counsel. But he just kept pleading the fifth to everything. Any question they asked him, I plead the fifth, I plead the fifth. So he kind of made a mockery of the whole thing. And apparently they held a little bit of a grudge. So JFK, he swore in 1961. And then all of a sudden, Marcello is deported as an undesirable immigrant. And so he's deported to Guatemala. But he actually is able to sneak his way back in on one of his shrimp boats. And his lawyers at that point are able to prevent him from being deported again. Which, you know, the only reason they were able to deport him in the first place, he's a sibling of like 8. And everyone else applied for citizenship, but he never bothered. But at this point, you know, he's got these lawyers, he's making a lot of money, he's a mob boss. And, you know, they are unable to deport him again. Allegedly, Jack Ruby was an associate of Marcello and Gianca organizations, and he had an uncle in New Orleans named Charles Dutz Murray, who was a well-known associate of the Marcello organization. In '66, Marcello served 6 months for assaulting an FBI agent. What? Okay. Then in '82, he got caught in a sting-off. They really wanted this guy. So he was sentenced 7 years in the Bree Lab corruption and labor racketeering case. So Bree Lab would be bribery and labor. So allegedly he and others had conspired to accept bribes and kickbacks to provide large state insurance contracts in the state of Louisiana. And then 3 months later, he found out who the judge was that was going to be presiding over this case and, you know, offered him a little money, as one does. And so then he got slapped with another 10 years for, you know, bribery. Well, then he suffered some strokes during his time in prison, and in '89, he got out. He was actually released after the 5th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals threw out the original conviction. So he essentially retired there and then died in '93. So he was apparently a multi-millionaire real estate developer. And, well, here's what's interesting. This is fun. So, you ever heard of Frank Costello? Well, Frank Costello was having some issues in New York. The mayor there, LaGuardia, was having a field day smashing up his slot machines and just tearing up his casino, I guess. Or casinos. So, LA Senator and former Governor Huey Long stepped in with a shadow investment from Mayor Lansky and all his political connections in LA. So he hooked up with Marcello. So Costello had a local legislator visit the state's Governor O.K. Allen, who then released Marcello and a full pardon after just 5 years. He ruled out jukeboxes, pinballs, and Costello's slot machines, established connections, paying off politicians and cops across the state. So I misspoke. I think I said something about shoemaking. Bookmaker was what I meant to say, where the investigations looked into Lee Harvey Oswald and his possible connections. So he had an uncle in New Orleans who was a bookmaker there. So the HSCA concluded that Marcello had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to be involved in the assassination. However, they couldn't find any actual proof of involvement. But this is interesting. After he died, his and Santo Trafficante Jr.'s attorney wrote a book alleging that on Trafficante Jr.'s deathbed, he, had a deathbed confession where he said, Carlos effed up. It shouldn't have been John F. Kennedy. We should have killed Bobby instead. And this was in 1987. And the HSCA actually listed a 1962 conversation during which Marcello was talking to a business associate by the name of Edward Becker. in which Marcello said, "Don't worry about that Bobby son of a bitch. He's going to be taken care of." And allegedly Becker recalled that conversation and recalled that, Marcello was alleging that with the president out of the way, Robert Kennedy would no longer have that kind of power. He said he couldn't remember his exact words, but he thought that Marcello was going to arrange the killing of John F. Kennedy, probably through a civilian, someone out of the mafia. So here's where I could pretty much summarize everything about the JFK assassination and give you information that is going to give you kind of an opinion on what really happened and who was really involved. So these were some of the doubts that I had after doing extensive research. I'm talking like 200 plus hours of research into the Assassinations Review Board and the Warren Commission report, the HSC findings, the Church Committee, and other outside sources as well. And of course, video footage and photos from the autopsy. So first off, we have how Jack Ruby had stood up and corrected the chief of police during that midnight conference on Oswald's involvement in the Fair Play for Cuba committee. Well, how would he know that unless he knew Oswald? Did he know Oswald? How would he know in order to correct? Or was he just trying to act like he knew a thing or two and jump in and agree with some of the reporters who were correcting the chief of police on that? So that's one thing. Then, of course, there's a possibility of the photos of Oswald and that rifle and that revolver having been doctored. And some of the more recent stuff that's come out that really does kind of look like perhaps there was a Dallas police officer that was actually the person in that photo. And that the committees who could really, without a doubt, say, we did handwriting analysis, he bought the guns, ended up being a very corrupt committee, and essentially nothing that they claimed ended up being really provable, or even in some instances at all believable. Then, of course, there's the fact that Oswald, worked at the book depository since October, either it was the 13th or the 16th, depending on which source you look at. And that's pretty interesting because he wouldn't have known about the motorcade or the motorcade route until November. So that's awfully convenient. That makes him a pretty convenient patsy. Unless, of course, he knew a thing or two or someone else knew a thing or two and got him that job. Because, of course, as we know, mob bosses bought politicians and police. And politicians maybe had some information that the public largely didn't. Although I find that fairly doubtful. I don't know, I just don't think that motorcade route was really established until much later. And I find it highly doubtful that that's why Oswald would have gotten that job at the book depository. There's also a lack of analysis regarding the angle of trajectory concerning the fatal shots fired apparently from the book depository. From what you can see from the videos available, the president was sitting fairly upright. And according to an interview with Agent Hill, the Secret Service agent who had jumped up and ridden with them to the hospital, the president was wearing a back brace, which would have prevented him from leaning forward very much. Yet he was allegedly shot from the 6th floor. And the angle of the shots, based on everything I could find, are pretty level with the position of the president's body. So that would indicate someone at a much lower level and almost directly behind. Now let's talk about this magic bullet theory. So I looked into this, okay? Not only did I speak with some friends and personal, close colleagues and such that do go hunting fairly regularly and have gone hunting in states where you can use full metal jackets. And I asked them, what are the chances that you shoot an animal, you hit bone, and that bullet keeps its shape? And in one instance, the person actually had the bullets from a .45 slug in a bag, or two of them actually, and showed me the baggie. I held it up, I looked at them, they were pretty much rounded out. They were flattened down into a ball. And he said this one hit, I think it was a shoulder blade, and the other one it had hit a leg bone or something. And granted, that's not the exact same caliber as what the rifle was, It's a little bit fatter and a little bit shorter. But I did a ton of research also into that specific caliber. So the specs that come up for that particular ammunition, for that rifle, the Carcano Mannlicher, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, is 6.5 by 52 ammo. So it comes up as .268 cal, which is actually .2675 inches. There's actually, as I mentioned before, I spoke with hunters and they were like, no way, this looks like it was fired into cotton. If you look at the photographs of the ammunition in, the National Archives as this pristine bullet, which was found on Connolly's stretcher. So they're alleging that Governor Connolly was shot, and I actually misspoke in video 1 where I said that it also hit him in the head. I guess I was kind of exaggerating on the extremeness of the assertion that it was one bullet and that it was a pristine bullet found on the stretcher. So the difference between like a soft point or a hollow point and a full metal jacket are that it's a harder material. So it's going to be like a solid metal, but a full metal jacket, it's going to be a harder material, and it's usually going to be known as like a through and through. So let's say you're looking into something for home protection. I recommend a soft point or a hollow point if that's legal in your state, because a through and through, it might damage your home or somebody standing behind the person you're shooting at or the object you're shooting at. But with a full metal jacket, once it hits bone, there's going to be damage to that bullet. And so I looked into this. Not only did I ask around to people that are hunters and have hit bone in, the activities of shooting deer, elk, bears, whatever. I also pulled up some of my own stuff. So I looked up, shooting the actual caliber that this rifle would have shot. And I found a video where a guy actually does do this. He shoots into multiple blocks of pine. And he does this multiple times and then pulls out the bullets. And in most cases, the bullet was relatively undamaged. However, you can see some damage from it being shot through the pine. So now let's talk about that and the hardness level of pine. So there is a hardness scale for wood. And pine is one of the softer metals where this specific scale, known as the Jenko hardness rating, pine is actually one of the softer ones at about 690, where some of them go much, much higher. So for example, heart pine would be a 910 to a 1225. Yellow pine would be about a 690. And southern pine would be about an 870. And some of the other woods that are much harder were quite a bit higher, maybe as much as 3 times higher in the hardness rating for wood. So there's something called the MOHS scale, and that's different in that it doesn't cover the hardness of wood. However, I was able to find something that kind of broke it down. And so it actually said that on that hardness scale, bone would be about a 5, whereas wood would be about a 2 or a 3. And pine, being one of the most soft woods, I would think is about a 2. And so I watched this video where this man shot that caliber into a bunch of blocks of wood, and I saw significantly more damage on those than on this bullet in the National Archives that is practically pristine. You can see the beveling that it was shot, but it looks like it was fired into, as I said, my coworker meant like some cotton or maybe even that kind of gel that they use. So with pine, you have significantly more damage based on what I saw. And pine, as I mentioned, is way softer on the hardness scale than bone. Now, let's talk about where the president and Connolly were shot. So it is plausible that a full metal jacket could have missed bone in the president, gone through his neck as it did, and then gone into the back of Governor Connolly. And it is possible that maybe it could have even then gone through his wrist and wound up in his thigh. However, that bullet that went through the governor's back, it actually shattered one of his ribs. And allegedly that same bullet then went through his wrist and then hit him in the thigh and then fell out of his thigh onto his stretcher and was this pristine bullet. That is, in my personal opinion, and I'm not proclaiming to be a professional, however, I've done a ton of research into this, I don't see how that's possible. I do not think it was the same bullet. Maybe the same bullet did go through the president and go through the governor's back and come out his chest, creating that sucking chest wound we mentioned earlier. But after shattering his rib, there is no way that bullet had practically zero damage on it. It's unbelievable. I mean, the chances are so slim. I can't even imagine that it then went on to go through his wrist and hand and wind up in his thigh. So this is an assertion by the Warren Commission that the HSCA even then, when they did their investigation some years later, agreed with. So this is one of the major things that says to me there was conspiracy, and here's why. So this Warren Commission, this is led by Earl Warren, Chief Justice Earl Warren. And, people were calling for his impeachment, which would make one think that maybe he was corrupt. But then you have these ridiculous findings in the Warren Commission report, and you even have well-known members, respected members saying this commission, some of their assertions were bogus, and they didn't do their proper research. They just wanted to find stuff that would confirm what they already wanted the public to believe. And as we mentioned earlier, talking about some of these mafia ties, politicians were in their back pocket. So it kind of makes me wonder if perhaps Earl Warren was in somebody's pocket, or perhaps he had a different agenda. Either way, we can reasonably believe that he was corrupt and that he did not do justice in trying to figure out what happened to John F. Kennedy and who was involved. And even the HSCA committee seems to be a little bit corrupt, in my personal opinion, just based on what I read, in that they did find some of the Warren Commission's findings to be redonkulous, but they confirmed a few, including this magic bullet theory. Now, again, as I mentioned, it is possible for a full metal jacket to go through one person and then another, but to come through unscathed is ridiculous. So why would they say this? Why? Why would they plant, here's what I think, is that bullet was planted. Well, because this bullet could then make ties saying, oh, we found this bullet, and this bullet came from this rifle. And they allegedly tested it along with the FBI and said, yep, it came from this gun. But guess what? Here comes a later investigation, the review board. And, was it the HSCA? Now that I'm sitting here talking about it, I'm trying not to sit here and just look at my notes and read them to you. So forgive me, maybe I'll come out with a later video, but I forget whether it was the HSCA or the review board. But it was one of the two that actually came out and went to reinvestigate and say, did this bullet come from this rifle and can we prove it? Which, by the way, the Warren Commission said, oh, yep, it definitely was. We could prove it by firing test shots. Well, they came back later, and I think it was actually the HSCA, which was only about 15 minutes later, if I remember off the top of my head. They could not confirm that those bullets came from that gun. And what they have to say about the reason why is, well, it was fired so much that it was fired so much in the testing afterward that it damaged the gun. And so we can't actually look at it and say, yeah, this was fired from the same gun. They could not confirm that those bullets came from that gun, which, okay, how much did they fire it while they were testing it? I mean, have you ever heard of this? Okay, I like guns. I think they're great. I think it's fun to shoot. I think if you're into hunting or even self-protection, I think you ought to have a gun. If you have mental health issues, maybe you shouldn't have a gun. But in what little I know of guns, firing it so much that you cannot find any sort of semi-conclusive evidence that a certain bullet, which, by the way, that's an imperfect. So ballistics matching is an imperfect thing. It's you cannot actually 100% without a doubt confirm that a specific bullet was fired from a specific gun by serial number. So there's different things to take into account, like multiple guns created around the same time frame from a specific manufacturer. They're going to have similar beveling to where it could look like any one of these guns could have fired this bullet. And so that's not a perfect science in itself. But usually they can determine, it was this type of weapon that was manufactured around this time frame that fired this bullet. But this committee, they couldn't even confirm that. They said that the barrel had been so damaged from having been fired so much that they couldn't confirm it. I've never heard of that being a thing. So that kind of suggests to me it suggests to me a couple of things. So first of all, how much were they firing this thing in testing it? I don't even think that's possible that you could damage it that much in just test firing. But if it is, no, I just don't think it is. And so that kind of brings into question, it brings forth doubts as to whether this was actually the rifle used in the assassination attempt, or even at least to have fired that bullet, that pristine bullet that was found that would then lead to this magic bullet theory. And then there's, even the HSCA didn't attempt to determine the slope of the shot. So you really can't confirm that it was shot from the 6th floor. And like I mentioned, Oswald was seen within 2 minutes of the the shots on the 2nd floor. Although, while there's this big part of me saying, Oswald's a patsy, I don't think he did it. Maybe he was involved. I don't know. I have doubts. Kind of seems like maybe it was more likely that he was shot from a lower floor, if from that building at all. Although if you look at the footage and you look at the autopsy and you look at everything, it really does look like he was shot from that general direction. I just don't know about that angle. I mean, honestly, for me to know without a doubt, like for me to come up with a conclusion, and I know that once a bullet hits a body, it can do some weird things. The angle can do some weird things. It can go off in this direction or that, or hit a bone and follow the bone. The president seems to have been shot, and it seems to be straight through and through from a level angle with his body position at the time. And Elm Street is slightly downhill, but from what I could find, it's only about a 1 foot difference from the base of the book depository to the position of the vehicle that he was in when he was shot. And then, of course, you think about the 6th floor, and that's going to be roughly 65 feet up from there. So the angle doesn't match up in my mind. I would love the opportunity to go and put a chair in the middle of Elm Street where the X is, where they actually marked a white X where the president was shot. And I'd like to have a person sit in that chair and I'll take a laser pointer and align it with, the trajectory of the in and out points and see where that laser pointer points. And I have my doubts that it would point at the 6th floor, but I mean, what do I know? There's a part of me that wondered if he was shot from the left, and I haven't heard that come out at all. And the only reason I say that is because in the autopsy, the photos of the president, instead of what we see in TV shows today where there's like a rubber block beneath the neck, there was actually a metal support underneath his head. And it covers up a part of the left side of his head. And if you look at that, what appears to be an exit wound over here on the right side, you could believe that, yeah, he was shot from behind where they said in the autopsy, or maybe from the left. I'm not saying he was shot from the left. I'm just saying it's a thought. It's an idea. I have no clue. I don't think anyone's saying this. I just have so many questions. Also of note, as I mentioned before, the Zapruder film is going to be one of your best films to look at if you're trying to determine what really happened. And the original is gone. The person that had the original had it in a safe deposit box. That person died of a heart attack, and supposedly that footage was just thrown out. I don't know, but it's gone as far as we know. The public, anywho. But I did find footage that was actually from the other side, and I wanted to use this to kind of confirm some of the things I'm saying today. But guess what happened? It disappeared. I can't find it. I went through my search history, my view history, and I could not find this footage that I had found previously. I don't know if it was taken down or what, but I cannot find that. But please send it to me if you are able to find it. Maybe maybe it was like in the middle of a video somewhere and I missed it. I don't know. Then there's some other footage that you can find, which kind of shows the book depository during the time of the assassination. And you do see what looks like a flash coming from around that vicinity, or a couple flashes, I should say. In my opinion, it doesn't prove that much. The footage is pretty grainy. It is, I'm not saying that it's impossible he was shot from the 6th floor. I'm just saying that I have my personal doubts, and I'm not a pro. I don't know anything. I'm just applying logic to the situation here, and it doesn't add up for me. I actually did a bunch of crazy math in trying to figure out like the angle, like a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and this was the distance and everything, and it still didn't add up, that angle of trajectory. I've seen some stuff put forth online, but the official agencies, they really ignored this. They didn't look into the angle of trajectory. They just were like, yeah, he was shot from the 6th floor. And there was this convenient sniper's nest found, and there were casings found. Were they planted? Maybe. So another one of the doubts that I could bring forth here, that I could pretty much just summarize everything with, are the timing of the shots. So, I mean, there is a version with the sound, and I mean, there's a few, and it's boom, boom, boom. And that last one is a totally different boom. It sounds like a completely different gun. And the alleged weapon that supposedly belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald, it's a bolt-action rifle. So, for those of you who don't know what that means you need to grab something here that goes to reload, and then realign your shot, and then fire. So, for him to be able to do that quickly is fairly improbable. I mean, yes, he was in the Marine Corps for a while, so maybe one could assert that he was an expert shot. But even with a bolt-action rifle, that's pretty difficult to do, and it's actually impossible. Even according to some of the findings, that the FBI admitted to, they had one of their sharpshooters recreate firing this weapon, and the minimum time, it was like 2.3 seconds or something in between shots, and that's just not the elapsed time that's happening, and even confirmed in the Zapruder footage, if you can find the one that actually includes sound. And then, even then, to think that this guy still had aim on a moving target. Yes, it's moving away from you in front of you, so it's not like you really have to lead. It's still going to be something that's very difficult to achieve. So that right there would almost prove that there was more than one shooter. They could have been together in that same window if they were even in that window. Maybe there was a different window, maybe there was a different location. But in my mind, that kind of clears Oswald, or at least clears him of being a lone shooter. Then, of course, as I mentioned, we have these ties to the mafia. So Oswald may have had ties to Marcello. Ruby definitely had ties to Marcello. Was Oswald actually a wife beater, as indicated in, for example, the Warren Commission reports, which said that he had a lot of problems. There was like some fights that they had. Maybe he was a bit of a wife beater. And I don't know anything about the mafia. I know what I've seen in movies is that they don't like wife beaters, but I can't confirm that. And it kind of makes me wonder, I don't know, was he a convenient patsy to them because he was problematic or he had mental health issues? Or was he just a convenient patsy because he worked there? I don't know. But here's what we do know. The Warren Commission was corrupt, and they led us to the conclusions that they wanted America to believe were bogus. And who worked with them closely? The FBI. And who was most compliant and everything? The CIA and the FBI. Well, who may have had problems with JFK? We were allegedly under the brink of World War III under him regarding the Soviet Union. And the CIA and some people here didn't like that. The FBI worked really closely with the Warren Commission. The Secret Service was very, very problematic for the Assassination Records Review Board, established in 1992, that actually got down to work in 1993. They would say that the Secret Service, gave the most problems in saying, going to the president and saying, hey, we don't think this should be released. We don't think this should be released. And in a lot of cases, the president overruled them. So that's curious to me. Then we have this autopsy weirdness, where the man who performed the autopsy, he threw away the original autopsy report and redid it by memory. I've heard a few different things about this. All I can confirm is that he did in fact throw away the original and redo it. Why would you do this? I don't know. It's strange. Then, of course, there's the allegation that his brain went missing from the National Archives. I couldn't confirm this through certain sources, but I did see it through, I think it was like the Huffington Post or something. There was only like 2 places that I could find that allege this. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, but if that is the case and it did go missing, that's fairly interesting. And I wonder why. And then there's the fact that, and you can actually see the footage of this, there was a lineup to identify Lee Harvey Oswald. And they placed him up against teens in completely different outfits. And he actually, there's footage of him complaining about this and going, oh, so you're going to line me up against these guys wearing this and I'm wearing that. So I stand out. And they were just like, yeah. And they pushed him in there. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, and there's just all that convenient evidence left behind. What is up with that? I mean, and the casings from a revolver? Come on. Is this guy an idiot? Or is he a convenient patsy? You tell me. Tell me that the mafia wasn't involved. At this point, I'm not suicidal. Let's just say that right now. But I would think, it was everyone. They were all involved. Secret Service, the politicians, the FBI, the CIA, the mafia, 100% the mafia. But definitely collusion with some of the government agencies that we don't trust today. So specifically, some of the stuff that the Secret Service, didn't want to release is the names of individuals who had made threats on JFK's life. I had some of the specific details, but it's page 63 of 174 of the Assassination Records Review Board report. If you're curious to look it up. I have so many questions, and based on all of that, really, what can we say? If Harvey Oswald was involved at all, Lee Harvey Oswald, we know he didn't act alone. Even some of the official organizations that looked into this said as much. What were some of the reasons that we might have wanted to get rid of JFK? Well, he was largely loved by the public. However, he had some enemies. He upset quite a lot of people. There was the fact that the mafia helped get him into position, with funding and stuff, helped get him elected. And then as soon as he became president, he established like a committee or a group to take down the mafia in America. So there's that. Of course, he was kind of a thorn in Marcello's side. There was the stuff that was happening like with the Soviet Union, and I think it was the North Wall in Berlin or something involving Germany. And then, of course, just other agencies. He did piss off a lot of really powerful people. So, yeah, follow, and subscribe for more interesting stuff like this. But I'm not saying without a doubt any one person was involved. I think it was everyone. And I think there were multiple reasons. But Oswald was a patsy. That's one thing we know for sure. Whether he was involved at all, I don't know. Have a wonderful day or night, and I hope you enjoyed this.